Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India News Hour, India's voice to the world. I'm Mark Lynn, and now we're going across live to the G20, the G7 summit, and we are showing you visuals of Prime Minister meeting the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. This is for the outreach program of the G7. Visuals that have just come in a short while ago. Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the Outreach Summit at the G7, where he will be speaking as well. India is expected to raise the concerns of the Global South and act as a bridge between the G7 and the Global South countries. Once again, we continue to show you this visual, which has come in just a short while ago, of Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting with the Italian Prime Minister who's hosting the G7 summit. Currently, Italy is in the presidency of the G7, taken over from Japan, and will be handing it over to Canada, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of this year. The G7 pretty much now tries to align its work with the G20, and India played a significant role in the G20 as well last year when India was the president and continues to be on the troika of the G20. But India also playing a very significant role in the G7, as India has been invited 11 times to the G7 summits, and this is the 5th time that Prime Minister Narendra Modi is at the G7 summit. India continues to be the largest, the fastest growing large economy of the world, and if we do look at the history of the G7, then G7 is a grouping of industrialized countries. But of course, countries like India and emerging countries are growing at a much faster pace than the G7 themselves, though these industrialized countries continue to direct much of the flows that concern global markets and also the global architecture. At this outreach summit, there will be talk also on artificial intelligence and the framework and rules-based order that G7 hopes to promote, and taking a lead in terms of where artificial intelligence should go. We continue to show Prime Minister's arrival at the outreach program for the G7. Amrit Pal is joining us on the phone line. Amrit, put this into context for us. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to talk about various issues for the Global South at this outreach program.
That's right, Mark. So the world leaders from the partner countries of the G7, the invitee countries, have arrived. Also, the organizations, there are 5 organizations, 12 countries, of which India is one, who are partner countries at the Italy summit of G7. They've arrived for the first outreach session. The Prime Minister is expected to make an intervention here. He could touch upon a range of issues ranging from AI to counterterrorism. But I think the mainstay or the main focus of his intervention and address to the G7 leadership and also the attending partner countries would be to talk about the priorities, concerns, needs, aspirations of the Global South. The Prime Minister is expected to put into context that given the present challenges that the world faces, and how the global governance architecture is structured at the present way, needs to be more inclusive to include the Global South, countries of the Global South. He's expected to reiterate what was agreed at the New Delhi Declaration of the G20, which India hosted last year. and bring in greater synergy between what was achieved there and what is achieved at Burgo and Asia. Primarily because the G7 also is a part of the G20. So the roadmap agreed at G20, which is a larger grouping than the G7, has a sizable representation of the global south. The agenda and the roadmap is much more inclusive. So the Prime Minister is expected to stress upon this in his intervention or address at the outreach.
Right, Amrit, you do mention that, of course, the G7 is a subset of the G20 in a sense, but they still believe that they are, a grouping in themselves. Ever since the creation of the G20, to what extent has, the G7 continued to call the shots in a sense, or are they on the wane?
The G7 has been around for a very long time. This is the 50th summit of the G7 in 1975 when they first met as a loose grouping to deal with the economic crisis then. G20 is a much later development because as the world changed, other parts of the world started asserting themselves, and the need for a larger grouping was felt to deal with the challenges being faced by the world. But yes, G7, because they are a very powerful grouping for the simple reason that they comprise of the world's seven largest economies. Though that is changing, India has overtaken some of the economies of the G7, but that grouping still punches far above its weight because they are industrialized economies, leading economies of the world. So they carry a certain political and strategic heft with them, and have a longer history than, say, the grouping of G20. Therefore, they punch much above their weight. But as things are changing, the need for inclusivity, the need to understand that solutions to the world's problems cannot be provided by just a select few. And it has to be more broad-based. And therefore, I think the G7 also, there is a certain realization in G7 about that, and that's why you see countries like India being invited for the 11th time.
True.
And, they engaging with the developing world by inviting them as partner countries, even if not a part of the grouping. So that realization is setting in, but as Mark happens in geopolitics, that those who control the levers of power don't let go of it easy. So it is a work in progress, really.
Yes, indeed. And of course, India is after the US, Germany and Japan is the largest economy there, actually. The others are all smaller than India in size. The fact is that also India continues to be the fastest growing economy in the world, and India presents opportunities for the G7 to, sort of bring in inclusive growth through through this bridge that India could be with the global south, and to counter, in a sense, the rise of non-democratic countries in the economic sphere, China in particular, which, you require India to act as that counterweight.
As a counterweight, yes, probably in geopolitics and
geoeconomics as well.
Economics as well. There is a big concern here at the G7 about what they are referring to as the industrial overproduction by China, which is greatly hitting the interests or harming the interests of the Western Bloc. But that is a clash of interests, really. India, in its participation at the previous G7 summits, last year the Prime Minister spoke at Hiroshima, where he talked about life and to deal with the climate change challenges. India doesn't look at it as any kind of one-man upmanship. It rather acts as a voice of reason and saying on conflicts, for example, when Prime Minister Modi met President Zelensky, this was his advice to him, or that was what was conveyed to President Zelensky, that dialogue and diplomacy is the way forward. So India is trying to act as a voice of reason. India is trying to act as a bridge between the global south and the developed world, saying that unless you take these people along, unless you take this part of the world along, you cannot solve the problems or the challenges being faced for the world. To come to think of it, the G7 countries account for about 45% of the world's GDP, but have just about 10% of the world's population living. On the other hand, the G20, the global south, so to speak, has about 2/3 of the world's population living in there. And they are the most vulnerable societies. They are the weaker the economy, the more vulnerable the people are to any kind of changes in the global arena. So therefore, India is trying to act as a voice of reason, a voice of inclusivity, and saying that the world must collectively address the problems and not just look at it from the prism of a select few. Mark.
Indeed. Amrit, when is the Prime Minister expected to make his intervention?
This is a 3-hour session. The Prime Minister could make his intervention in about an hour or so. Mark.